Have you ever noticed that strange contradiction? How the same love that's supposed to liberate us often seems to trap us instead. It's one of those peculiar patterns that hides in plain sight. So common we rarely stop to question it. Think about the language we use. Falling in love, as if it's a descent. Being lovesick, as if it's an illness. Dying for someone, as if obliteration is the goal. There's something almost suspicious about this pattern. Why do we consistently describe what should be life's greatest joy in terms of suffering, submission, and self-denial? The contradiction extends beyond language into behavior. The lover who stays in a relationship that diminishes them because that's what love requires. The parent who sacrifices their dreams entirely because that's what loving parents do. The friend who tolerates mistreatment because love means accepting everything. In each case, love somehow transforms from liberation into obligation, from joy into sacrifice, from strength into submission. There's something strange about this correlation, a peculiar pattern that warrants deeper investigation. This paradox becomes even more intriguing when we notice how consistently religious and moral traditions frame love in terms of self-denial and suffering. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life. Love is patient, love is kind. It is not self-seeking. To love is to sacrifice. These aren't random spiritual insights, but follow a systematic pattern. Love is consistently equated with self-diminishment, with putting others first, with sacrificing one's own desires and needs. There's something almost suspicious about the consistency of this framing. The uncomfortable question lurking beneath this pattern is disturbing. Have we been taught to call love what is actually something else entirely? What if much of what we've been conditioned to identify as love is actually guilt, obligation, dependency, or fear disguised in more appealing language? What if the beautiful costume of love has been placed over something far less noble? Our terror of isolation, our fear of judgment, our dread of meaninglessness. This isn't merely an academic question. It strikes at the heart of our most intimate relationships, our deepest values, and our fundamental understanding of human connection. If we've been calling love what is primarily guilt and obligation, how might this distortion affect our relationships, our happiness, and our psychological well-being? What might become possible if we distinguished between authentic love and its counterfeit imposters? And who better to guide us through this uncomfortable territory than a man who spent his life examining the psychological foundations of morality, a philosopher who dared to ask whether our most cherished values might actually be serving very different purposes than we imagine, a thinker who had the courage to look beneath the beautiful masks of traditional morality and expose what lurks behind them. What if I told you that over a century ago, one of history's most penetrating minds uncovered this pattern and traced its implications to their unsettling conclusion? A thinker who recognized that behind our most sacred conceptions of love often lurks something much less divine, the systematic confusion of love with guilt, obedience, and self-punishment. What might we learn by following his investigation? Why do we find it so difficult to distinguish between love and sacrifice, between genuine care and obligation? Could it be that entire moral systems have benefited from keeping these concepts confused? What if the ultimate liberation isn't finding the perfect love, but rather freeing love from its centuries-old association with guilt and self-denial? The answers to these questions might challenge your most basic assumptions about love, relationships, and human connection. They offer a perspective on love not as sacrifice and submission, but as expression of strength and freedom. Are you ready to follow where they lead? There's a striking pattern in how love is conceptualized across moral and religious traditions that becomes visible once you start looking for it. A pattern so consistent, it can't be dismissed as coincidence. It emerges in the peculiar correlation between love and self-denial, between care and sacrifice, between connection and submission. This pattern doesn't appear randomly. It follows a specific and predictable trajectory, revealing itself most clearly in how the concept of love has been systematically linked with suffering and self-diminishment. Consider how love is framed in religious traditions. In Christianity, the highest form of love is exemplified by Christ's suffering on the cross, literally sacrificing himself for others. In Buddhism, love requires detachment from desire and ego. In various traditions, loving God means submitting one's will completely to divine authority. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Authentic love is portrayed as requiring the diminishment of self, the surrender of desire, the subordination of one's own needs to those of others. What makes this pattern truly revealing isn't its occasional appearance, but its remarkable consistency across diverse contexts. The specific theological details change, the cultural expressions shift, but the psychological function remains strikingly consistent. Love is systematically equated with sacrifice, submission, and self-denial. This correlation is too consistent to be coincidental. This pattern becomes even more intriguing when we notice how it manifests in relationship expectations. The good partner is the one who sacrifices more. The loving parent is the one who completely subsumes their identity in their children. The true friend is the one who gives without expectation of return. In each case, the worthiness of love is measured by the degree of self-diminishment it involves. The more you suffer, sacrifice, and subordinate yourself, the more authentic your love is considered to be. The anomaly extends beyond personal relationships into social expectations. Women are traditionally praised for loving self-sacrifice in relationships. Religious adherents are admired for their loving submission to divine authority. Children are taught that loving others means putting themselves last. The pattern repeats. Love is systematically conflated with subordination, obligation, and self-denial. What's particularly striking about this pattern is how rarely we acknowledge it explicitly. We discuss love, romance, care, and connection at length, but we seldom examine this specific correlation, how consistently the concept of love has been intertwined with guilt, obligation, and self-sacrifice. It's as if we've collectively agreed not to notice how the most beautiful of human experiences has been systematically linked with suffering and self-diminishment. And that's where our investigation truly begins, with the recognition that what we call love might have been systematically distorted to serve purposes far different from genuine human connection and flourishing. What if the concept of love has been deliberately or unconsciously confused with guilt, obligation, and self-denial precisely because this confusion serves particular psychological, social, or moral functions? This is the question that haunted a 19th century philosopher whose insights into human psychology were so profound, so disturbing, that they continue to challenge us today. A man who dared to ask whether our most cherished conceptions of love might actually be serving very different purposes than we imagine. What did Friedrich Nietzsche discover about this strange relationship between love and guilt? And why does his discovery remain so unsettling and potentially liberating more than a century later? What if what we've been taught to call love is often just fear disguised as virtue, obligation masquerading as choice, guilt pretending to be care? These questions lead us to Nietzsche's disturbing insight. They called it love when it was really fear of being alone. In the summer of 1882, Friedrich Nietzsche experienced an intense and brief romance with Lou Salome, a brilliant young Russian philosopher who would later become a pioneering psychoanalyst and close colleague of Sigmund Freud. Their relationship, though ultimately not romantic, profoundly influenced Nietzsche's thinking about love, relationships, and human connection. Unlike the conventional romantic relationships of their Victorian era, their connection was based on intellectual passion and philosophical exploration rather than traditional notions of romance and domesticity. It was in this context, experiencing a form of connection that defied conventional moral boundaries, that Nietzsche began to formulate his most penetrating insights about how the concept of love had been distorted within Western moral traditions. His personal experience with Salome provided a vivid contrast to the guilt-ridden, sacrifice-oriented conception of love that dominated 19th century European culture. Here was a relationship based on mutual intellectual growth rather than mutual self-sacrifice, on enhancing each other's strength rather than celebrating each other's submission. What made Nietzsche's perspective on love especially valuable wasn't merely his philosophical brilliance, but the convergence of his personal experience with his intellectual journey. Having grown up in a devoutly Lutheran household dominated by women, his father died when Friedrich was only 4, Nietzsche had intimate knowledge of how Christian morality shaped conceptions of love. Yet his own experience, both in his relationship with Salome and in his observations of relationships around him, had led him to question the psychological foundations of these moral conceptions. During this period, as Nietzsche alternated between intense creative work and debilitating illness, he contemplated how religious and moral traditions had shaped the very concept of love. He noticed something that few had articulated before: how consistently love had been equated with self-denial, suffering, and submission across Western moral traditions. Rather than seeing this as evidence for the spiritual nature of love, he recognized it as revealing something profound about how moral systems function, not to enhance human flourishing, but to constrain the vital energies of life through psychological mechanisms of guilt and self-punishment. In his notebooks from this period, filled with his increasingly aphoristic writing style, Nietzsche began to develop what would become one of his most disturbing insights: that what we call love had been systematically confused with guilt, obligation, and self-denial precisely because this confusion served the interests of moral systems designed to tame human vitality. Love, as conceptualized within Christian morality, wasn't the celebration of life's abundance, but rather a sophisticated mechanism for internalizing self-punishment and restraint. What made this insight especially powerful was that it didn't come from abstract theorizing, but from Nietzsche's own experience of how moral conceptions shaped human relationships. Each day, as he observed the marriages, friendships, and family relationships around him, he noticed how consistently the language of love was used to justify self-diminishment, to rationalize staying in diminishing relationships, and to glorify submission as virtue. Each day he observed how the beautiful mask of love concealed the much less beautiful reality of guilt, fear, and obligation. It was this personal observation of how moral concepts functioned in real human lives that gave Nietzsche's philosophical insights their unusual penetration and emotional force. He wasn't merely analyzing moral concepts academically, he was uncovering their psychological function through his own lived experience and observations. As he would later write in Beyond Good and Evil, "Whatever is done from love always occurs beyond good and evil." This wasn't mere provocative rhetoric, but a profound insight into how authentic love might exist beyond the moral frameworks that had distorted it into a form of self-punishment. This is the context from which Nietzsche would develop his unsettling analysis of how love had been systematically confused with guilt within Western moral traditions. It wasn't merely a critique of Christian morality, but a profound psychological insight into how our most intimate human connections have been shaped by concepts designed primarily for social control rather than human flourishing. What evidence did Nietzsche find for this disturbing pattern? And what implications might it have for how we understand love, relationships, and human connection? Nietzsche's first evidence for his hypothesis came through his meticulous examination of religious texts and moral traditions. With the careful eye of a trained philologist, he traced how the concept of love had been framed across Western moral history. What he discovered was a striking pattern that few had bothered to notice: the systematic correlation between love and self-denial, between care and sacrifice, between connection and submission. In The Gay Science, published in 1882, Nietzsche offered his initial observations of this pattern. What is done from love always takes place beyond good and evil. This deceptively simple statement reveals Nietzsche's recognition that authentic love exists outside moral frameworks of duty and obligation. Yet these frameworks had consistently claimed love as their territory, redefining it in terms of moral duties rather than vital affirmation. What made this observation so penetrating wasn't merely identifying the moral framing of love, which many had acknowledged before, but recognizing its psychological function. How the concept of love had been deliberately or unconsciously confused with guilt and obligation to serve particular social and psychological purposes. Love hadn't merely been described in moral terms. It had been fundamentally redefined to serve moral purposes, primarily the taming of human vitality through internalized guilt. Nietzsche found evidence for this pattern in Christian texts and traditions, where love was consistently framed in terms of sacrifice, suffering, and self-denial. He noted how the highest exemplar of love in Christian tradition, Christ on the cross, literally embodied the equation of love with suffering and self-sacrifice. Rather than seeing this as spiritual insight, he recognized it as revealing something profound about how Christian morality functioned, not to enhance human flourishing, but to constrain vital energies through psychological mechanisms of guilt and self-punishment. This insight gained further support from Nietzsche's analysis of Christian moral psychology, particularly in On the Genealogy of Morals. There he traced how Christian morality had developed the sophisticated concept of love as self-denial, precisely to internalize moral control. Rather than external constraints imposed by law or authority, Christian morality created internal constraints through concepts like love as sacrifice, transforming natural human vitality into moral duty and obligation. Perhaps most compelling was Nietzsche's observation of how this moral redefinition of love manifested in human relationships. He noted how consistently the language of love was used to rationalize remaining in diminishing relationships, to justify self-destructive sacrifice, and to glorify submission as virtue. The pattern was remarkably consistent. What was called love often functioned primarily as a sophisticated mechanism for self-punishment and restraint. This observation allowed Nietzsche to recognize something that few had articulated before, that what we call love often functions psychologically not as celebration of life's abundance, but as mechanism for managing guilt. The moral conception of love doesn't enhance human connection, but distorts it, transforming what could be mutual flourishing into mutual diminishment through reciprocal guilt and obligation. What makes this evidence so compelling isn't any single instance, but the consistent pattern across religious texts, moral traditions, and human relationships. From Christ on the cross to the self-sacrificing mother, from the submissive wife to the self-denying friend, the same correlation appears. Love is systematically equated with suffering, sacrifice, and self-denial. This correlation is too consistent to be coincidental. But if Nietzsche's initial observations revealed this pattern, his deeper investigation would uncover something even more profound: how the systematic confusion of love with guilt serves particular psychological and social functions, primarily the constraint of human vitality through internalized moral control. The beautiful mask of love conceals a much less beautiful reality: the deliberate or unconscious use of intimate human connection as vehicle for moral domination. What deeper patterns did Nietzsche discover as he continued his investigation? And what implications might these patterns have for how we understand love, relationships, and human connection? As Nietzsche deepened his investigation, he discovered that the confusion of love with guilt extended far beyond explicit religious contexts into the very psychology of Western humanity. Even in seemingly secular relationships, he found the same underlying pattern at work: the transformation of love from vital affirmation into moral obligation. The specific language might change, but the psychological function remained consistent. What was called love often functioned primarily as a sophisticated mechanism for managing guilt and internalizing moral restraint. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, published between 1883 and 1885, Nietzsche expanded this analysis through his concept of the spirit of gravity, the psychological tendency to transform life's joys into heavy burdens of duty and obligation. Not by wrath does one kill, but by laughter. Come, let us kill the spirit of gravity. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that the transformation of love into duty doesn't occur through external coercion, but through internal psychological mechanisms that make heaviness and suffering seem virtuous and lightness seem frivolous or selfish. What made this insight especially powerful was Nietzsche's recognition that this psychological pattern wasn't merely religious, but revealed something fundamental about how morality functions. In Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, "The noble soul has reverence for itself. This isn't merely a statement about aristocratic pride, but a profound psychological insight. Authentic love emerges from self-affirmation rather than self-denial, from strength rather than weakness, from abundance rather than lack. Yet moral systems consistently promote the opposite view, that love emerges from self-diminishment, sacrifice, and submission. Nietzsche began to see that this pattern revealed something essential about how moral systems control human behavior, not primarily through external constraints, but through internalized guilt. By systematically confusing love with sacrifice and submission, moral traditions create internal psychological mechanisms that constrain human vitality more effectively than any external authority could. When people believe that loving means sacrificing themselves, they become their own moral police, restraining their own vitality in the name of virtue. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most disturbing insights, that what we call love often functions primarily not to enhance human connection, but to constrain human vitality through sophisticated mechanisms of guilt. As he writes in The Antichrist, "What is good? All that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness." This isn't merely a celebration of power in the crude sense, but a recognition that authentic love emerges from vitality and strength, rather than from the weakness and diminishment that moral traditions celebrate as loving sacrifice. The pattern became increasingly clear. What we call love had been systematically confused with guilt, obligation, and self-denial, precisely because this confusion serves particular psychological and social functions, primarily the constraint of human vitality through internalized moral control. By teaching people that true love means suffering, sacrifice, and submission, moral traditions create internal restraints more powerful than any external authority. This insight allowed Nietzsche to recognize something that few had articulated before, that the psychological power of moral conceptions of love lies precisely in their ability to transform natural human vitality into internalized guilt and self-punishment. As he writes in Daybreak, "Morality is the self-division of man." This isn't merely abstract philosophy, but profound psychological insight. Moral conceptions of love create internal division, turning natural human desires into sources of guilt and shame rather than celebration and affirmation. What implications might this understanding have for how we approach love, relationships, and human connection? And what might it reveal about the possibility of love beyond guilt, a form of connection that emerges not from moral obligation, but from vital affirmation? As Nietzsche continued his investigation, a striking pattern emerged across diverse domains of human experience. The confusion of love with guilt wasn't isolated to particular relationships or religious contexts, but appeared with remarkable consistency throughout Western culture. The pattern was clear. Wherever intimate human connection appeared, moral frameworks transformed that connection from vital affirmation into obligation and self-denial. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche articulated this pattern with characteristic clarity. There is not enough love and goodness in the world to permit giving any of it away to imaginary beings. This passage points to Nietzsche's recognition that the moral redirection of love toward abstract duties and obligations doesn't enhance human connection, but diminishes it, leaving actual human relationships impoverished by diverting vital emotional energies toward moral phantoms of obligation and guilt. The pattern revealed itself in how parental love was conceptualized. Rather than celebrating the natural joy of nurturing new life, moral frameworks consistently framed parental love in terms of sacrifice, duty, and self-denial. The good mother wasn't one who found joy in nurturing, but one who suffered most completely for her children. The loving father wasn't one who delighted in his children's development, but one who sacrificed his own flourishing for their benefit. The pattern repeated. Natural joy in connection was systematically transformed into moral duty and sacrifice. In romantic relationships, the same pattern appeared. Love wasn't framed as mutual flourishing, but as mutual sacrifice, each partner demonstrating their worthiness through their willingness to suffer for the other. The more you sacrificed, the more truly you loved. The more you subordinated your needs, the more authentic your care. The pattern continued. Vital connection was systematically transformed into moral competition of self-sacrifice. Perhaps most revealing was how this pattern manifested in religious conceptions of divine love. God's love wasn't primarily framed as creative joy, but as sacrificial suffering. Christ on the cross, rather than the divine creativity celebrated in Genesis. Human love for God wasn't framed as celebration of life's abundance, but as submission of will. Not, I rejoice in your creation, but I submit to your authority. The pattern persisted. Even divine connection was systematically framed in terms of sacrifice, submission, and self-denial. What made this pattern so powerful wasn't any single instance, but its remarkable consistency across contexts. Whether in parenting, romance, friendship, or religious devotion, the same psychological mechanism operated. Vital human connection was systematically transformed into moral obligation and self-denial. As Nietzsche writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, one must learn to love oneself with a wholesome and healthy love, so that one can bear to be with oneself and need not roam. This isn't mere self-help rhetoric, but profound psychological insight. Authentic love emerges from vital self-affirmation, rather than from the self-denial that moral traditions celebrate as virtue. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most penetrating insights, that behind many of our most cherished conceptions of love often lurks something much less beautiful: the systematic confusion of love with guilt, designed primarily to constrain human vitality through internalized moral control. What we call love had become, for many, primarily a psychological mechanism for self-punishment, rather than a celebration of life's abundance. As this pattern became increasingly clear, Nietzsche began to recognize its profound implications. What if many of our relationships, family structures, and intimate connections have evolved primarily not to enhance human flourishing, but to constrain human vitality through sophisticated mechanisms of guilt? What if the concept of love has been systematically confused with obligation and self-denial, precisely because this confusion serves the interests of moral systems designed to tame human vitality? This recognition wasn't merely an academic observation, but a profound challenge to how we understand love, relationships, and human connection. If we've been taught to call love what is primarily guilt and obligation, what might become possible if we distinguished between authentic connection and its moral counterfeit? What form of love might emerge if we stepped beyond the moral frameworks that have distorted it into a mechanism for self-punishment? The implications of Nietzsche's discovery reach far beyond philosophical curiosity into the very heart of how we understand love, relationships, and human connection. If the concept of love has been systematically confused with guilt and self-denial, then addressing this confusion requires more than merely questioning moral frameworks. It demands a fundamental reconsideration of how we approach our most intimate human connections. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche explored these implications through his concept of the three metamorphoses of the spirit, from camel to lion to child. The camel represents the spirit that bears the weight of moral duty and obligation, transforming love into a heavy burden of sacrifice. The lion represents the courage to say no to these moral distortions, creating space for something new to emerge. The child represents the capacity for genuine creation, for saying yes to life and forming connections beyond moral frameworks of guilt and obligation. This sequence reveals Nietzsche's profound insight. Moving beyond the confusion of love with guilt requires not just intellectual rejection of moral frameworks, but the courage to create new forms of connection beyond the shadow of traditional morality. The first profound implication is psychological. If we've been taught to confuse love with guilt and self-denial, then authentic connection requires disentangling these concepts at the most fundamental psychological level. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, what is done from love always takes place beyond good and evil. This isn't merely provocative rhetoric, but profound psychological insight. Authentic love exists outside frameworks of moral evaluation, emerging not from obligation but from vital affirmation of life's abundance. The second implication is relational. If the concept of love has been distorted into mechanism for mutual self-punishment, then healthy relationships require new models of connection based on mutual flourishing rather than mutual sacrifice. As Nietzsche suggests in Beyond Good and Evil, the degree and kind of a man's sexuality reach up into the ultimate pinnacle of his spirit. This isn't crude celebration of sexuality, but recognition that authentic connection emerges from vital affirmation rather than from the moral denial of life's fundamental energies. The third implication is existential. If love has been conceptualized primarily in terms of self-denial and sacrifice, then authentic living requires reconceptualizing love as expression of vital strength rather than moral virtue. As Nietzsche writes in The Will to Power, what is happiness? The feeling that power increases, that resistance is overcome. This isn't crude glorification of domination, but recognition that authentic joy emerges from expressing life's abundance, rather than from restraining it through moral frameworks of guilt and obligation. Perhaps the most profound implication is liberatory. If the confusion of love with guilt has functioned primarily to constrain human vitality through internalized moral control, then distinguishing between authentic connection and its moral counterfeit might release tremendous vital energy previously trapped in mechanisms of self-punishment. As Nietzsche writes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, I tell you, one must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. This isn't mere poetic flourish, but profound psychological insight. Creative vitality emerges not from moral restraint, but from embracing life's fundamental energies without the distorting lens of guilt. What does this mean for how we approach love, relationships, and human connection? If we've been taught to call love what is primarily guilt and obligation, what might become possible if we distinguished between authentic connection and its moral counterfeit? What form of love might emerge if we stepped beyond the moral frameworks that have distorted it into a mechanism for self-punishment? As Nietzsche suggests, the path toward authentic love begins not with more perfect moral virtue, but with the courage to question moral frameworks themselves, to ask whether what we've been taught to call love might actually be something very different. The liberation of love from guilt might be not only personally transformative, but culturally revolutionary, releasing vital human energies previously trapped in sophisticated mechanisms of self-punishment disguised as virtue. The pattern Nietzsche uncovered extends beyond individual psychology into what might be called a conspiracy of morality, a collective cultural agreement to confuse love with guilt for purposes that have little to do with enhancing human connection. This isn't a conscious conspiracy in the crude sense, but rather a cultural evolution driven by the interests of moral systems designed primarily for social control rather than human flourishing. In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche traced how this conspiracy evolved through the development of moral frameworks that transformed natural human vitality into internalized guilt. What began as external constraints imposed by law or authority gradually evolved into internal constraints imposed by concepts like love as sacrifice, concepts that effectively turned people against their own vital energies by making them feel guilty for their natural desires and inclinations. This cultural evolution wasn't driven by malicious intent, but by the fundamental interests of moral systems themselves. As Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, morality in Europe today is herd animal morality. This isn't merely pejorative language, but recognition that moral systems evolve to serve the interests of social stability and control. And few psychological mechanisms serve these interests more effectively than the confusion of love with guilt and obligation. What makes this pattern particularly compelling is how it manifests across seemingly different domains. Religious institutions promote conceptions of love that emphasize sacrifice and submission. Educational systems teach children that being good means putting others first. Therapeutic approaches sometimes reinforce the equation of love with self-denial. Each domain develops its own language, but the psychological function remains consistent, confusing love with guilt to create internal mechanisms of moral restraint. The conspiracy extends into cultural narratives about relationships, where stories of romantic love consistently emphasize sacrifice and suffering as evidence of love's authenticity. It appears in family structures, where parental love is measured by willingness to sacrifice rather than capacity to flourish. It emerges in friendship, where being a good friend means subordinating your needs to others. The pattern persists. Vital human connection is systematically confused with moral obligation and self-denial. What makes this pattern so powerful isn't any single manifestation, but its remarkable adaptability. As traditional religious frameworks lose cultural authority, the same psychological mechanism continues through secular forms. Therapeutic languages of codependency, political discourses of sacrifice for the collective, consumerist narratives of proving love through material sacrifice. Different language, same psychological function, confusing love with guilt to create internal mechanisms of moral restraint. This recognition reveals something profound about Western psychology, that it often continues the same moral patterns while changing only the surface language. The person who sacrifices themselves in relationships, because that's what good people do, is engaging in essentially the same psychological mechanism as the religious ascetic, confusing love with guilt and self-punishment, under the guidance of moral frameworks that benefit from this confusion. Nietzsche's penetrating insight wasn't merely that love had been confused with guilt, but that this confusion serves specific cultural functions, primarily the constraint of human vitality through internalized moral control. The real conspiracy isn't religious doctrine, but the deeper cultural pattern of transforming natural human connection into sophisticated mechanisms of self-punishment disguised as virtue. This pattern raises profound questions about human psychology, cultural evolution, and the possibility of authentic connection. If we've been collectively engaged in confusing love with guilt for purposes that have little to do with enhancing human flourishing, what might become possible if we consciously distinguished between authentic connection and its moral counterfeit? What version of love might emerge if we stepped beyond the cultural frameworks that have distorted it into a mechanism for self-punishment? As we continue our investigation, we'll explore why this pattern has remained largely unacknowledged and what it might mean for the possibility of genuine transformation, both individual and cultural, in how we understand and experience love. Why has the systematic confusion of love with guilt remained largely unacknowledged despite its profound influence on human relationships? The answer isn't a conscious cover-up, but rather a collective investment in moral frameworks that benefit from this confusion. Addressing it would mean questioning not just specific moral teachings, but the very psychological foundations of Western morality, a prospect simultaneously liberating and terrifying. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche offers a penetrating insight into this collective avoidance. The most fundamental desires of life aim not only at preservation, but at intensification. But morality, as it has been understood hitherto, is the instinct of decadence itself, turning against life. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that moral frameworks often function in direct opposition to life's fundamental vitality, and few moral mechanisms serve this function more effectively than the confusion of love with guilt and self-denial. Religious institutions have an obvious stake in maintaining this confusion. By teaching that authentic love requires sacrifice, submission, and self-denial, religious frameworks create powerful internal mechanisms of moral control, mechanisms far more effective than external authority because they operate through people's deepest emotional connections. It's not that religious leaders consciously promote this confusion, but rather that their entire moral framework depends on maintaining the equation of love with self-denial and submission. Cultural narratives reinforce this pattern by consistently portraying true love in terms of sacrifice and suffering. From romantic stories where love's authenticity is measured by willingness to suffer to family narratives where parental love is equated with complete self-sacrifice, dominant cultural frameworks often celebrate precisely those aspects of love that serve moral control rather than human flourishing. It's not a conscious conspiracy, but rather the natural evolution of cultural systems that benefit from transforming vital connection into moral obligation. Educational systems often perpetuate this pattern by teaching children that being good means putting others first, essentially training them from earliest years to confuse love with self-denial. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, learning changes us. It does what all nourishment does that does not merely preserve, as the physiologists know. This insight reveals how education might serve not just to transmit knowledge, but to transform natural human vitality into moral restraint through concepts like love as sacrifice. Perhaps most significantly, this pattern remains unacknowledged because addressing it would mean confronting what Nietzsche called the death of God, not merely questioning specific religious beliefs, but confronting the collapse of the entire moral framework that has structured Western understanding of concepts like love. This prospect is so psychologically challenging that many prefer the familiar comfort of moral frameworks, even if they come at the cost of authentic connection. The pattern persists, not through conscious suppression, but through the simple human preference for moral certainty over psychological complexity, for clear rules over ambiguous possibilities, and for the comfort of virtue over the challenge of authenticity. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, "Only as creators can we destroy." This passage reveals his recognition that moving beyond the confusion of love with guilt requires not just rejecting moral frameworks, but creating new conceptions of love beyond the shadow of traditional morality, a task both liberating and terrifying. What does this mean for the possibility of authentic love and genuine human connection? If we've been collectively engaged in confusing love with guilt for purposes that have little to do with enhancing human flourishing, what might become possible if we consciously distinguished between authentic connection and its moral counterfeit? What version of love might emerge if we stepped beyond the cultural frameworks that have distorted it into a mechanism for self-punishment? As we approach our final exploration, we'll examine what Nietzsche's discovery reveals about the possibility of love beyond guilt, not through finding more perfect moral virtue, but through liberating love from its centuries-old confusion with obligation and self-denial. What might emerge when we finally distinguish between authentic connection and its moral counterfeit? The final question isn't whether love requires sacrifice, but whether what we've been taught to call love might actually be something very different, a sophisticated confusion of genuine connection with guilt and obligation. Nietzsche's discovery reveals something profound about human psychology, our tendency to transform vital connection into moral duty. But it also reveals something even more significant, the possibility of love beyond guilt, a form of connection that emerges not from moral obligation, but from vital affirmation. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche articulates this possibility through his concept of the gift-giving virtue, a form of generosity that emerges not from moral duty but from overflowing vitality. I love him who squanders his soul, who neither seeks nor offers thanks, because he always gives and does not want to preserve himself. This isn't celebration of self-destruction, but recognition that authentic generosity emerges from abundance rather than obligation, from having so much life that giving becomes natural expression rather than moral sacrifice. This isn't about rejecting love, but transforming how we understand it, moving from a conception based on guilt and self-denial to one based on vital affirmation. Perhaps authentic love isn't measured by how much you sacrifice, but by how fully you affirm. Not just the other, but yourself as well. Not just connection, but the vital energies that make genuine connection possible. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary in things. Then I shall be one of those who make things beautiful. Amor fati. Let that be my love henceforth. What might this look like in practice? It means examining your relationships for patterns of obligation disguised as love, noticing when you do things not from genuine desire, but from guilt or fear. It means asking whether your conception of love serves your vital flourishing or constrains it through sophisticated mechanisms of self-punishment. It means recognizing when you use phrases like, if you loved me, you would, to transform connection into obligation. It means developing relationships based on mutual flourishing rather than mutual sacrifice. Partnership not as competitive self-denial, but as collaborative affirmation, each person bringing their fullest vitality to the relationship rather than diminishing themselves in the name of love. Parenting not as martyrdom, but as joyful nurturing that enhances both child and parent. Friendship not as obligation, but as genuine celebration of each other's unique becoming. Most importantly, it means recognizing that the voice that emerges when you stop confusing love with guilt isn't selfish cruelty, but authentic care, what Nietzsche called the gift-giving virtue that emerges naturally from vital abundance rather than from moral constraint. This isn't arbitrary self-indulgence, but recognition that genuine care emerges most powerfully not from obligation, but from affirmation, from having so much life that giving becomes natural expression rather than moral duty. The path forward isn't about rejecting love, but liberating it, moving from a conception based on guilt to one based on vital affirmation. Whether within traditional relationships or beyond them, authentic connection requires distinguishing between love and its moral counterfeit, between the natural joy of connection and the artificial burden of obligation disguised as virtue. What might become possible if you stopped confusing love with guilt and self-denial? What relationships might emerge if you distinguished between authentic connection and moral obligation? What voice might you discover if you separated the natural joy of giving from the artificial virtue of self-sacrifice? The answer to these questions won't come from more perfect moral virtue, but from the courage to question moral frameworks themselves, to ask whether what you've been taught to call love might actually be something very different. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, what does your conscience say? You shall become the person you are. This isn't about becoming whatever you want, but rather discovering and expressing the authentic connection that emerges when love is no longer confused with guilt. The real journey isn't finding more perfect ways to sacrifice yourself in the name of love, but liberating love itself from its centuries-old confusion with guilt and obligation. Perhaps the most profound insight isn't that we need more love, but that we need to distinguish between authentic connection and its moral counterfeit, between love as vital affirmation and love as sophisticated mechanism for self-punishment. As Nietzsche ultimately suggests, true love begins not with more perfect sacrifice, but with the courage to question whether sacrifice is what love requires at all. Perhaps authentic connection emerges, not from how much you're willing to suffer, but from how fully you're able to affirm, not just the other, but yourself as well. Not just connection, but the vital energies that make genuine connection possible. Perhaps, as Nietzsche discovered, the most liberating truth of all is that genuine love begins precisely where guilt ends.